Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. According to an old MIT study, we are right on track for societal collapse. Welcome to the Sunday Sum Up, everybody. According to Vice, which is reporting on this, in 1972, a team of MIT scientists got together to study the risks of civilizational collapse. Their system dynamics model, published by the Club of Rome, identified impending limits to growth that meant industrial civilization was on track to collapse sometime within the 21st century due to overexploitation of planetary resources. And I know what you're thinking. Yeah, we've already known for a long time now that overexploitation of the planet's limited resources was unsustainable. Capitalism is unsustainable. We have finite resources on a single planet, so a system of economic growth that requires ever-continued expansion of economic growth is fundamentally impossible at the end of the day. But anyway, there's a bit more to this. The controversial MIT analysis generated heated debate and was widely derided at the time by pundits who misrepresented its findings and methods. But the analysis has now received stunning vindication from a study written by a senior director at professional services giant KPMG, one of the big four accounting firms as measured by global revenue. The study was published in the Yale Journal of Industrial Ecology in November 2020 and is available on the KPMG website. It concludes that the current business as usual trajectory of global civilization is heading towards the terminal decline of economic growth within the coming decade, and at worst, could trigger societal collapse by around 2040. So even big accounting firms and big financial institutions who operate within and rely on capitalism can see the writing on the wall. Now, to be fair, when they're talking about societal collapse and civilizational collapse, they're largely talking about the collapse of the current system, kind of the way how, for example, the Bronze Age collapse did not result in the outright eradication of humanity, but boy howdy did it result in a really long, dark period of time before humanity got its situation together again. That is what we are likely headed for. We are headed for an industrial age collapse. Humanity might persist in some form in various little selected communities. New nations or empires may arise. There's going to be lots of people moving due to the climate catastrophe and extreme heat and volatile weather patterns. People are going to be both internally and externally displaced. A lot of coastal cities where a lot of the world's economic wealth is generated are going to be at the forefront of this battle and collapse. And that is on top of what we already know we are locked into, which is not a good time based on our current trends. Everyone beginning to see why I wanted to talk about Youngbei yesterday? I'm going to need to listen to his entire discography after today. So in the report and on the Vice article, there's a bunch of different graphs. Like it's worth it. I will provide the links down below. It's worth it just to take your time, read through it, see for yourself how they're measuring things and their justifications for it. But to broadly sum up, the current business as usual trend is not good or sustainable. That's the one that will lead to societal collapse by about 2040, potentially. There are other models that show with the adequate application of technology and resource management, we could make a somewhat sustainable future where, okay, economic growth still tapers off, but at least people are kind of taken care of and there isn't as massive collapses. In other words, we provide a cushion for the fall rather than free falling off a cliff that we don't even realize we're headed towards. And again, this brings us to that infamous saying by a lot of communists and socialists and people on the left, which is that we have two choices, socialism or barbarism. I know which one I would personally prefer, but I don't think we're going to get that. And before I delve further into that open-ended statement, let's also just take a minute, because I'm sure there's some people watching this right now, because I actually have hate watchers on this channel, and my god, it's adorable. But before you think, oh no, oh, Vice, not a trustworthy news source, Vice is talking about an old MIT study that was published. MIT. That's the actual source here, not Vice. Vice is bringing awareness to it. And then again, there's the second report by KPMG, a massive capitalist firm that is also recognizing, yeah, this is a problem and it's very much real. And second, even though the article is 2 years old, we have 12 years to limit climate change catastrophe, warns the UN. The world's leading climate scientists have warned there's only a dozen years for global warming to be kept to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which even half a degree will significantly worsen the risks of drought, floods, extreme heat, and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. So right there, we even have modern evidence of how these reports are backed up, and we are right on schedule for societal and civilizational collapse. If there's a silver lining to this, it means, yay, capitalism will likely collapse within our lifetime. But does that mean a global socialist order replaces that and there's an actual smooth transition away from it and we actually take care of people? Probably not. Because let's think about who's in charge. Here's Biden saying, I guess people were wrong and capitalism's doing well, thanks. The global elite all subscribe to capitalism and to the neoliberal ideology that is ruining the planet and has been ruining the planet since it first reared its ugly head under Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s. This cabal of greedy scumbags are the people who actually rule the world, and they're the ones pushing out a lot of reports showing, no, see, here's why things are fine, and we're totally going to increase oil exploration even though we know the planet's dying. And yes, we suppressed that information decades ago because at the end of the day, we're responsible only to our shareholders. And that is the core of the problem. When you are only responsible to shareholders and delivering financial gains and keeping your shareholders happy, the rest of the world and humanity and, your nations be damned. Do you think Coca-Cola has any actual loyalty to America? No, they have loyalty to their shareholders and to markets. All these people complaining about video games kowtowing to the Chinese government by, making apologies and no, we can't talk about free Tibet or whatever the issue may be, the Uyghur genocide and such. Whatever the issue is, no, we got to keep China happy because that's a market of 1 billion people. Can't you see the dollar signs, baby? That's why Activision, Ubisoft, EA, whoever it is, don't give a shit about your nation and its values. They give a shit about how much money they can make. They are businesses, not moral institutions, which is why the idea of these people being, as certain libertarians and ANCAPs want, just get rid of government regulation, everything will be fine. No, because their shareholders will say, well, slavery is really cheap, so it is not sustainable. And many people are recognizing this, but unfortunately, their tendrils of power have gotten everywhere. And I'm going to come back to that, but now I actually need to talk about the other major story that I wanted to talk about this morning from across the pond. So remember Brexit and how it was supposedly going to lead to better things and cut a lot of red tape and Britain will be a true sovereign independent nation again and all that other horse crap, right? So with that in mind, food shelves are empty in many parts of Britain. And despite what some people are trying to say, it absolutely has everything to do with Brexit. So Brexit made it very difficult for what the Brits call lorry drivers or truck drivers to get across the border and drive around and basically ensure that food gets to where it needs to go. Compounding this problem is the fact that because Britain has left the EU, a lot of migrant workers don't feel comfortable staying and have either left or are saying they will leave very soon. This means that a lot of those migrant workers who came from Eastern and Southern Europe worked in the fields of Britain picking the food. So right now, food is literally rotting in the fields of Britain because no one can get out there to harvest it and then transport it to market in time. And so the pictures from British shopping markets are actually pretty disturbing. The right-wing media in Britain is trying to blame the shortages on what they're calling a pingdemic because, too many of the lorry drivers, because they're driving everywhere, they get a ping on their phone that they may have been exposed to COVID, so they have to isolate, and that's what's happening. So it's not because of Brexit. Meanwhile, people are saying that lorry drivers wouldn't even have the COVID app because if they did, they would be pinged constantly, considering they drive and deliver all over the place. And even independent food retailers have said that the shortage is absolutely due to Brexit and not the pingdemic as the right wing is calling it over there. And again, to point out, here's this article from Wales Online. We're on fire, says Hollier, facing worst driver shortage in 50 years. So yeah, because of Brexit, you can't get truck drivers and you can't get migrant workers in your fields. I feel like people mentioned this in the lead up to Brexit and people refer to this as scaremongering. And here we are being vindicated. And then there's other people on the right wing saying, oh, well, this is because of all the EU's red tape. It's like, you wouldn't have red tape to deal with if you just stayed in the European Union. Like, this is an example of a country making a mess of things by their own hand and yet refusing to see it. You made your mess, now lie in it. It's still kind of wild to me that Britain just openly decided to shoot itself in the foot and vote to leave the EU. And now this is just one of the many consequences that they are facing for this rather unwise choice. And all this talk about empty store shelves and food, it's the morning, so I'm getting kind of hungry. I think it's time for breakfast. I wonder what the people are eating in long-term care homes for breakfast here in Ontario. That is shameful and offensive and should piss off every single Ontarian. But again, this isn't really a surprise because guess what? Under capitalism, and if everything is for profit, you're going to do your best to cut corners. Oh, we're just going to throw grandma and grandpa in a home. It's fine. They'll be fine. Who cares if they have Alzheimer's and can't properly communicate? And this is how things like seniors abuse happens. In what world is 2 little breakfast sausages and a tiny little wedge of white toast a substantial, healthy, robust breakfast for anyone? That is not breakfast, that is table scraps. But that's what you get in a for-profit system. And not just for long-term care, but for anything. For healthcare, you can expect stuff like that because, oh, well, it's for profit, so we gotta cut expenses, or you have to pay through the nose. What if we made transit instead of public transit? It was private transit. Okay, well, welcome to your terribly maintained cars because they want to just push vehicles and, oh, the vehicles are actually on lease from people who own them and they are on the hook for anything that happens to the car, not the company, etc., etc., etc. Privatization is not actually good in the vast majority of cases. And if this is what seniors are getting in long-term care, imagine what else they are getting, or rather aren't getting, in terms of their needs, medication, cleanliness, hygiene. It's probably a horror show. In fact, we know it is. When the military went into our long-term care homes, they were so horrified that mental health experts had to be brought in. And yet we still decided to reward former Premier Mike Harris with the Order of Ontario because he's doing such a bang-up job running Chartwell, one of the main for-profit home organizations. Fuck this province, man, I swear to God. And while we're talking about this godforsaken province, there's still been very little actual large-scale coverage of the clearance protests that have been happening in Toronto. Various activists have been showing up to try and show solidarity with homeless people because of, again, the numerous factors that are affecting homelessness in Toronto. Some people might remember a while back, the city tried to sue a man, a local carpenter, for making little shelters for homeless people so that they could survive on the streets in the worst temperatures that the Canadian winter has to offer. Instead of seeing that as an embarrassment and a failing on their part, they decided, no, you know what? We need to sue this guy rather than actually take care of people's needs. And the mayor, John Tory, I think at the time said something about, yeah, look, we do agree that we need to use, human dignity and compassion here, but this is against bylaws and blah, blah, blah. Which brings us to today, where again, the media is not talking about the absolute brutalization of protesters by the Toronto police for standing up for homeless people, just literally minding their own business. They are literally displacing people who have nowhere else to go so that they can film movies in Toronto again. Oh, and to add insult to injury, there is a regulation to the Ontario Police Services Act that requires the destruction of use of force information within 30 days of a report being filed. There is no similar regulation anywhere else in Canada. Hey, how much use of force was used in the G20 protests? Oh, I don't know, man. That was destroyed 30 days after the thing happened. Think about all the instances of police brutality that they have gotten away with over the years, if not decades, due to this regulation. But no, we can't defund or abolish the police. They're doing good things, which is why, again, in the case of Toronto, we have them brutalizing homeless people, brutalizing activists for pointing out that homeless people don't have anywhere else to go. It's so important that they clear out parks and encampments so that movies can be filmed here again. And it's still totally not sketchy what happened with them doing a mental health check for Regis Korchinski-Paquette before she fell from her 27th story balcony. And the only word we have to go on is that of the police, who are totally not corrupt at all. And Toronto's really, there's no bad apples there. And it's not like there was also that issue that I talked about a while ago with the cops in Ottawa being corrupt and literally pushing fentanyl on the streets. And it's not like the RCMP stood by and did next to nothing while Mi'kmaq lobster traps in their warehouses were being burned by racist white people on the East Coast. And it's not like the RCMP continued to abuse activists and protesters in Fairy Creek, in the Wet'suwet'en area. There's also, as I pointed out in our Dark Side of Canadian History playlist, the Starlight tours from the Saskatoon Police, where they basically drove drunk natives around, and by around I mean out to the middle of nowhere in the hopes that they would die trying to reach any kind of shelter. But no, cops are fine, policing is good. We just have to get rid of a few bad apples and everything is fine, which is why we should continue to devote nearly 50% of municipal budgets to the police. This is totally fine and sustainable and not actually crippling our cities and causing more problems than this solves, right? If we want to change this, we have to change who gets into the areas that can change bylaws, which means I really need society to start caring about municipal politics for once. And so I guess this circles back around to everything. We have a decade now to try and fix a global problem that is backed up by fact and science, while having to fight against basically the most powerful and wealthy entities that the world has ever seen, with a police state behind them, and a good chunk of the global population, conservatives here in Canada, Republicans in the States, Tories in Britain, etc. Good chunks of people willing to fight and die for the apocalypse because it'll make libs mad or whatever. We have to fight against all that. And we got 10 years. How many election cycles is that? For municipal politics to defund the police, for provincial politics to kick out people like Doug Ford, for federal politics to elect people who will take the climate crisis seriously, whether it's the Liberals, Conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, Tories, Labor. You see the problem? I'm not a doomer, and even saying a pragmatist or being a realist doesn't feel like the right words. It's more like I know humanity and I know what we're gonna do, or rather not do. And my intuition is telling me that with the few election cycles we have, and with the lack of global cohesion to try and address things like climate change, the pandemic, these are things that we are going to struggle with. And with the arms of the police serving and protecting the interests of the neoliberal state, the hopeful scenarios from the MIT study showing the total societal collapse, I think that's where we're headed. And I really, really want to be wrong. But in 2022, as an example, if the Democrats lose and the Republicans get in and continue to stymie the Democrats, and then in 2024, whether Trump or a different president comes in, whether Biden gets reelected, do we really think that then the next 4 years until 2028 are going to see the massive changes needed? The great problem with democracy is that the political leaders have a vested interest in what secures their reelection and their continued power. So they're always going to look out for those interests above all. So in Germany, they're going to be talking about the economy and the migrant crisis and trying to manage the European Union. In Britain, it's going to be about stuff related to Brexit and an economic recovery, and also keeping foreigners out of their borders. Gee, I'm noticing a trend here. America, pretty much the same deal. Do you think that the global order that continues to profit off of capitalism and the permanent continued exploitation of resources from poor countries that they don't care about, and that they know the political class that ultimately, if push came to shove, would still bar these people by force if necessary from trying to seek a better life? The coming decade is going to be terrible for the climate crisis, but also the humanitarian crisis. And no nation will be exempt from this. People are going to be internally displaced from Canada to Chile to South Africa to Australia to the remote reaches of China. This crisis is coming for us all, and we are not equipped, nor are we in the mental headspace necessary to begin addressing a global problem as a global society. This isn't to say that we are doomed and that there won't be good moving forward. This is to say that while we live to see the collapse of capitalism in our lifetime, it's not in the best way possible. And that's what's bothering me today.